My name is Alina. I used to think the smell of antiseptic was the scent of healing. Now it's the scent of a grave. I never imagined that the man who promised to protect me in our wedding vows would one day be the one to sign my death warrant in a sterile hospital room. It was a Tuesday in Seattle, a city that was drowning under a relentless, charcoal-gray downpour. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, a rhythm that felt like a ticking clock I couldn't stop. I was pacing, my silk lounge robe cold against my skin. My husband, Julian Vance, a man whose name was synonymous with tech gold and unbreakable power, was late. It wasn't just the delay that gnawed at me, it was the silence. Julian lived on his phone, yet tonight his calls went straight to a dead-end voicemail. Earlier that afternoon, we had fought. A sharp, ugly argument about an offshore trust he had established in my name, $50 million I never asked for. He called me ungrateful, I called him distant. The last look he gave me wasn't one of anger, but of a chilling, calculated indifference. At 12:45 a.m., the landline shrieked. In the midnight stillness, it sounded like a scream. My heart hammered against my ribs as I grabbed the receiver. A voice, monotone and professionally cold, identified themselves from St. Jude's Memorial. Mrs. Vance, your husband has been involved in a high-speed collision on I-5. He's in critical condition. Doctor. Silas Thorne is prepping him for emergency surgery as we speak. You need to come now. Dr. Thorne, our family friend, the man Julian trusted with his life. That should have comforted me, but instead a primal dread seized my gut. I didn't change my clothes. I threw on a trench coat over my silk robe, grabbed my keys, and drove like a ghost through the flooded streets. When I burst into the surgical wing, gasping for air, the hallway was a tunnel of blinding white light. I saw the sign, Operating Room 4 in session. I reached for the handle, desperate to see him, to touch his hand one last time. But before my fingers could graze the cold steel, a firm hand clamped onto my arm and dragged me into the shadows of an adjoining utility closet. Don't make a sound if you want to live, a voice hissed. It was Sarah, a young surgical nurse I'd seen at Julian's charity galas. Her face was bloodless, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. My husband is in there, let me go, I whispered, screamed. Your husband isn't the patient, Alina, she whispered, her grip tightening until it bruised. He's the architect. Hide, trust me, if they find you out here before you're prepped, you won't make it to sunrise. I obeyed. I stood in that dark, cramped closet listening to the thrum of the ventilation. 10 minutes passed, the longest 10 minutes of my life. Then the hiss of the pressurized doors opening echoed in the hall. I peered through the narrow crack of the door, and what I saw froze my blood solid. Dr. Thorne stepped out, casually peeling off blood-stained latex gloves. But he wasn't alone. Walking out behind him, upright, healthy, and wearing surgical scrubs, was Julian, my Julian. There were no bandages. No shattered ribs. He looked at his watch and sighed as if he'd just finished a tedious board meeting. Then a third person emerged from the shadows of the OR. It was Isabella, my younger sister. She wrapped her arms around Julian's neck and kissed him, a kiss that tasted of a decade of betrayal. Is the paperwork ready? Isabella asked, her voice dripping with a venom I had never heard. Thorne has the forged consent forms, Julian replied, his voice deep and steady. By tomorrow morning, Alina will have a fatal reaction to the anesthesia during her emergency procedure. The insurance payout is double for medical accidents. We'll be in Switzerland by the weekend. I slumped against the closet wall, my hand over my mouth to stifle a shriek of agony. My husband, my sister, my doctor, they weren't just waiting for me to arrive, they were waiting for the body they had already planned to bury. The fury that rose within me was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was cold, it was sharp. It was the birth of a monster they hadn't bargained for. I wasn't just a wife anymore, I was a witness. And if they wanted a tragedy, I was going to give them a massacre. The shadows of the utility closet felt like they were shrinking, threatening to crush me under the weight of the words I had just heard. Behind the thin wooden door, the three people I loved most in the world were negotiating the price of my life. I watched through the crack as Isabella smoothed the lapel of Julian's scrubs, her eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. She wasn't the sister I had raised, she was a stranger wearing her skin Thorne, make sure the sedative is high enough that she doesn't struggle, Julian instructed, his voice as calm as if he were ordering a drink at a bar. I don't want any marks on her arms. It needs to look like a clean, systemic failure, an unpredictable cardiac arrest. Dr. Thorne nodded, his clinical gaze devoid of any humanity. Don't worry, Julian, I've written the script for this a dozen times. The grieving widower, the tragic loss of a young wife, it's a narrative the board of directors will swallow without a single question. Just make sure you handle the insurance adjuster on your end. They turned the corner, their footsteps echoing like hammers on a coffin lid. Sarah, the nurse, finally let go of my arm. I collapsed onto a stack of folded linens, my breath coming in ragged, silent gasps. The betrayal was so absolute it felt like a physical mutilation. You have to get out of here, Alina, Sarah whispered, her voice urgent. If they see you now, they won't wait for the operating table. They'll kill you in this hallway. Why? I managed to choke out, my eyes burning with unshed tears. Why are you helping me? Sarah's expression hardened into a mask of bitter resentment. Dr. Thorne has a specialty in these kinds of accidents. My brother was a patient here a year ago, a minor surgery, a major insurance policy, and a complication no one could explain. Thorne bought a new yacht a month later. I've been waiting for him to slip up. I've been waiting for a witness. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and handed me a small black USB drive and a master key card. I swiped these from Thorne's office while they were prepping the room for Julian. The drive contains the real surgical logs, the ones that prove Julian was never a patient tonight. The key card will get you into the basement records room and the security server. The basement? I shook my head, my mind spinning. I need to go to the police, Sarah. I need to get as far away from this place as possible. You won't make it to the parking lot, Sarah said, grabbing my shoulders. Julian has private security guards at every exit. They aren't hospital staff, they're his personal mercenaries. If you walk out that front door, you'll disappear before you hit the sidewalk. You need leverage, Alina. You need the surveillance footage of Julian walking into this hospital tonight on his own 2 feet. Without it, it's just your word against a billionaire and a famous surgeon. In this city, that's a death sentence. I looked at the key card in my hand. It was cold, sharp, and felt like a weapon. Sarah was right. Julian didn't just have money, he had influence. He owned the narrative. If I wanted to survive, I had to steal the story back from him. The service elevator at the end of the hall, Sarah pointed toward a heavy metal door. It bypasses the main lobby. Go to level B3. The server room is at the end of the corridor. I'll go to the recovery wing and tell them I saw you in the waiting room. I'll buy you 20 minutes. If you aren't back by then, I'll trigger the fire alarm to give you a window to escape. I stepped out of the closet, the sterile white light of the hallway hitting me like a physical blow. I felt exposed, a target painted on my back. I moved toward the service elevator, my damp silk robe clinging to my legs, my heart thumping against my ribs so hard I thought it would shatter them. I reached the elevator and swiped the card. The doors opened with a heavy, industrial groan. I stepped inside and pressed B3. As the lift descended, I caught my reflection in the polished metal walls. I looked like a ghost, pale, wet, and broken. But behind the shock, something else was flickering. A cold, crystalline rage was beginning to settle in my chest, replacing the fear. The elevator dinged and the doors opened to a dimly lit corridor that smelled of ozone and old paper. This was the bowels of St. Jude's, far removed from the luxury suites upstairs. I stepped out, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. I followed the signs for IT and archives until I reached a heavy steel door. I swiped the card again. The server room was hummed with the sound of 1,000 cooling fans. Rows of black towers blinked with green and red lights. I found the main terminal and plugged in the USB drive Sarah had given me. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a skill I had learned while helping Julian build his first startup. I bypassed the encryption and pulled up the footage for the north entrance. I saw the timestamp, 12:15 a.m. A black sedan pulled up. Julian stepped out looking perfectly healthy, followed by Isabella. They were laughing. They were celebrating my death before I had even arrived at the hospital. "I have you," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. I began the transfer to the USB drive. The progress bar crawled 10%, 20%, 30%. Every second felt like an hour. I kept looking at the door, expecting Julian's mercenaries to burst in at any moment. Suddenly, the screen flickered. A notification popped up in the corner of the monitor. Remote access detected. Someone else was logged into the system. My breath hitched. I looked at the source IP. It was coming from Dr. Thorne's private office on the 4th floor. I froze. They knew. They were watching me. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the server room hissed open. I scrambled behind one of the server racks, clutching the USB drive to my chest. "Elena, I know you're in here, darling," a voice boomed through the room. It wasn't Julian, it was Dr. Thorne. He was holding a tablet in his hand, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. "Did you really think a little nurse could outsmart us? This hospital belongs to me. Every wire, every camera, every breath you take is under my control." He began to walk down the aisle, his shoes clicking rhythmically on the metal floor. "Come out, Elena, let's not make this difficult. If you give me the drive now, I might convince Julian to give you a quick end. Don't make me hunt you." I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering. I was trapped in a room with no exits, pursued by a man who saw me as nothing more than a biological error to be corrected. But as Thorne rounded the corner of the rack, I saw a heavy fire extinguisher hanging on the wall beside me. I didn't think, I acted. I grabbed the metal canister and swung it with every ounce of strength I had left. The fire extinguisher collided with Dr. Thorne's shoulder with a sickening thud. He let out a strangled cry, stumbling back into a row of server racks. The tablet flew from his hands, clattering onto the floor and skittering into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I grabbed the USB drive from the terminal. The progress bar had just hit 100% and bolted toward the door. "You're dead, Elena," Thorne's voice roared behind me, ragged with pain and fury. "There is nowhere on this earth you can hide from Julian." I burst into the corridor, my lungs burning. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and calculation. I couldn't go back to the service elevator. Thorne would just lock it from the system. I had to find another way out. I remembered the blueprints Julian used to brag about when he donated the wing, the old laundry chutes that led directly to the loading docks. I sprinted toward the end of the basement hall, my bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. Every shadow seemed to reach for me. Just as I turned the corner, the overhead lights flickered and died. For a heartbeat, the world was pitch black. Then the piercing wail of the fire alarm shattered the silence. Sarah, she had done it. In the strobing red light of the emergency system, I found the heavy iron hatch of the laundry chute. I threw it open, the smell of bleach and stale linen wafting up. I didn't hesitate. I climbed inside and let go. The fall was short but jarring. I landed on a mountain of damp hospital gowns in a massive bin on the B4 level. I scrambled out, my heart racing, and found myself in the loading bay. Outside, the Seattle rain was still a torrential curtain, blurring the world. I saw Julian's black SUV idling near the exit, his private security guards huddled under the awning, distracted by the fire alarm and the chaos unfolding upstairs. They were looking for a woman in a trench coat and a silk robe. I looked down at the bin I had just fallen into. I grabbed a discarded scrub top and a surgical mask, pulling them over my clothes, hiding the silk and the fear. I slipped out through a side door, hugging the brick wall. I was a shadow among shadows. I reached the edge of the parking lot where I had haphazardly left my car. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped the keys into a puddle. I hopped in, twisted the ignition, and roared out of the lot just as the first sirens of the fire department began to wail in the distance. I drove for 20 minutes, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every 3 seconds. I felt like the entire city was a trap. Julian's face was on every billboard, his influence was in every corner. I needed a safe place. I needed Marcus. Marcus was Julian's former head of security, the only man Julian ever feared. Julian had fired him 6 months ago, claiming Marcus was unstable. Now I knew the truth. Marcus had likely seen the rot beneath the empire and refused to be a part of it. I pulled into a 24-hour diner and used their payphone, my own cell phone likely tracked by Julian's tech team. "Marcus," I whispered when he picked up, my voice trembling. It's Alina. He tried to kill me. He's with Isabella and Thorne there at St. Jude's. There was a heavy silence on the other end, then the sound of a gun slide racking. Where are you? I told him. 10 minutes later, a battered gray truck pulled into the lot. Marcus hopped out, his face like granite. He didn't ask questions. He saw my damp robe, my bruised arm, and the terror in my eyes, and he knew. He ushered me into the truck and we sped away into the outskirts of the city. They have forged documents, Marcus, I said, clutching the USB drive. They were going to kill me on the table and call it an accident. I have the footage of Julian walking into the hospital. I have Thorne's private logs. It's not enough, Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the road. Julian has the governor in his pocket. He has the chief of police. You go to them with this and the drive disappears before you even finish your statement. We need to go bigger. We need to hit him where it hurts his ego and his investors. He took the truck up into a secluded cabin in the woods, a place Julian didn't know about. Inside, Marcus set up a laptop and plugged in the drive. As the files loaded, he let out a low whistle. It's worse than you thought, Alina, he said, pointing to a hidden folder labeled Project Lazarus. This wasn't just about insurance money. Julian is laundering capital for an offshore pharmaceutical group. They've been using St. Jude's to test unapproved drugs on unclaimed patients, homeless people, elderly with no family. They die, Thorne signs the death certificate as natural causes, and Julian gets a massive kickback. And I was the next test subject? I asked, a wave of nausea hitting me. No, Marcus said, scrolling through a list of investors. You were the loose end. You were starting to ask too many questions about the trust funds. If you died, the trust would automatically revert to Julian and he could move the final $500 million into the offshore accounts before the SEC caught on. You weren't a test subject, Alina. You were a bill that needed to be paid. Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and his face went pale. He turned the phone toward me. It was a news alert live from St. Jude's. Tragedy at St. Jude's Memorial, the reporter said. A fire broke out in the surgical wing tonight. Sources say Alina Vance, wife of tech mogul Julian Vance, was caught in the blaze. She was reportedly in the hospital following her husband's tragic car accident earlier this evening. Authorities are searching for her remains. My breath hitched. They were already erasing me. They were telling the world I was dead so that when they finally caught me, no one would be looking for a living woman. They're burning the evidence, Marcus hissed. The fire wasn't an accident. Julian is destroying the surgical wing to cover his tracks. But Sarah is still in there, I screamed, remembering the brave nurse who had risked everything. We have to go back, I said, standing up. I won't let another person die for my husband's greed. I have the truth on this drive, Marcus. Let's show the world the monster Julian Vance really is. Marcus looked at me, a grim smile touching his lips. I thought you'd never ask. Get your coat, Alina. We're going to crash a funeral. The cabin was silent, save for the crackling of the police scanner Marcus had tuned into. The news report had been a calculated blow, a preemptive strike to turn me into a ghost before I was even in the ground. I stared at the television screen, watching the smoke billow from the windows of the hospital where I was supposed to have perished. Julian was standing in front of the cameras now, a handkerchief pressed to his eyes, his shoulders shaking in a performance that would have won an Oscar. Isabella stood beside him, her hand on his arm, the picture of a grieving sister-in-law. He's good, Marcus muttered, his eyes narrowed as he checked the magazine of his sidearm. He's making sure that when the police find your remains, which will likely be some poor soul from the morgue, no one will ask for a DNA test. He thinks he's won, I said, my voice vibrating with a cold, sharp clarity I didn't know I possessed. He thinks I'm running. But Julian's biggest mistake has always been his arrogance. He thinks I'm a victim. He doesn't realize I'm his consequence. Marcus looked at me, a flicker of respect in his eyes. We can't just walk into the police station, Alina. The smoke hasn't even cleared and Julian's already got the city under his thumb. We need to hit the broadcast. The Vance Innovation Gala is tonight at the Grand Hyatt. It was supposed to be his victory lap for the new pharmaceutical merger. Every major news outlet in the country will be there, every investor, every camera. Then that's where we're going, I said. He wants to announce a merger, let's give him a merger of truth and consequences. We spent the next 3 hours in a fever of preparation. Marcus used his old security bypasses to map out the Hyatt's layout. I used the laptop to create a digital bomb. I compiled the surveillance footage of Julian walking into the hospital, the forged consent forms Thorne had prepared, and the damning evidence of Project Lazarus. I set it all into a looped video file with a simple, haunting title, The Living Will of Alina Vance. I need to look the part, I said, catching my reflection. I was still in the damp remnants of my silk robe and a stolen scrub top. Marcus drove me to a high-end department store that had just closed for the night. He didn't break the glass, he used a master key he'd kept from his security days. I walked through the darkened aisles of the designer floor. I chose a dress that was the color of midnight, a sleek, floor-length silk gown with a high neck and an open back. It was elegant, powerful, and morning-appropriate. I found a pair of obsidian earrings and a deep red lipstick. When I stepped back into the truck, I wasn't Alina the victim. I was the widow who refused to stay dead. The Grand Hyatt was a fortress of light and glass. Black SUVs lined the curb and the paparazzi were thick as locusts. Julian was inside, hosting the elite of Seattle. We pulled into the service entrance, Marcus dressed in a waiter's tuxedo he'd liberated from the store and me hidden under a heavy floor-length cloak. The server room for the ballroom's AV system is on the mezzanine, Marcus whispered as we navigated the back hallways. I'll get you into the booth. Once you're in, I'll take out the security feed for the main floor. You'll have 5 minutes before they realize the override isn't coming from the master console. That's all I need, I said. We moved through the labyrinth of the hotel like ghosts. Marcus was a shadow, his movements silent and lethal. He neutralized 2 security guards near the mezzanine with quick, non-lethal strikes, dragging them into a linen closet. He swiped his card and the door to the AV booth hissed open. Inside, the room was a glow of monitors and soundboards. Below us, through the reinforced glass, I could see the ballroom. It was a sea of black ties and sparkling diamonds. Julian stood on the elevated stage, a microphone in his hand, looking like a king. Today, we honor the memory of my beloved wife, Alina. Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, dripping with fake emotion. She was the light of my life, the heart of Vance Innovations. Her tragic passing tonight in the St. Jude's fire is a hole that can never be filled. But she would have wanted us to move forward. She would have wanted this merger to save lives. The crowd erupted in polite, sympathetic applause. I felt a surge of nausea so strong I had to grip the edge of the soundboard. Now, I whispered, my fingers dancing over the keyboard. Now, Julian. I plugged the USB drive into the master console. I bypassed the hotel's firewall and patched directly into the 50-foot LED screen behind him. On the stage, Julian was smiling, about to introduce his new partners. Suddenly, the screen behind him flickered. The corporate logo of Vance Innovations vanished. In its place, a grainy, high-definition video began to play. The ballroom went silent. It was the footage from the hospital. The timestamp was clear, 12:15 a.m., Julian Vance looking vibrant and healthy walking into St. Jude's. The crowd gasped, then the audio cut in. It was a recording Sarah had captured on her phone before the fire. Thorne and Julian discussing the emergency surgery that would end my life. By tomorrow morning, Julian's recorded voice echoed through the Hyatt, Alina will have a fatal reaction. The insurance payout is double for medical accidents. Julian froze. He turned around, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he stared at his own betrayal projected for the world to see. He looked like a man watching his own execution. What is this? Someone screamed from the crowd. Julian, what is this? I stepped out of the AV booth and onto the mezzanine balcony, throwing off my cloak. The spotlights that were meant for the stage caught the midnight silk of my dress. I looked down at him, my voice amplified by the secondary mic Marcus had patched into the system. The rumors of my death, Julian, have been greatly exaggerated, I said, my voice ringing out like a bell in the sudden silence. The cameras turned. 1,000 flashes erupted like miniature stars. Julian looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror that finally matched my own. Behind him, the screen shifted to the files of Project Lazarus, the names of the unclaimed victims, the forged death certificates, and the offshore accounts. Security. "Shut it down," Julian screamed, but his voice was thin and powerless. "It's too late, Julian," I said, walking slowly down the grand staircase toward the stage. "The stream is live. It's not just in this room, it's on every news site in the country. It's at the FBI headquarters, it's everywhere you can't reach." As I reached the floor, the heavy doors of the ballroom burst open. It wasn't Julian's mercenaries, it was the blue jackets of the federal authorities. Julian tried to run, but the crowd, his own friends and investors, parted like the Red Sea, leaving him standing alone in the center of the floor. He looked at me one last time, his face a mask of pure, poisonous hatred. "You'll have nothing," he hissed as the agents tackled him to the ground. "Without me, you're a nobody." "No, Julian," I said, standing over him as they clicked the handcuffs into place. "Without you, I'm finally Elena." I watched as they led him away, followed by a sobbing Isabella and a stone-faced Dr. Thorne who had been caught trying to flee the kitchen. The empire hadn't just crumbled, it had been demolished in front of the very people who built it. As the police cleared the room, Marcus appeared at my side. He didn't say anything, he just handed me a coat. We walked out of the Hyatt into the cool Seattle air. The rain had stopped. The city was quiet. I looked up at the stars, the first time I had seen them in years. I didn't know what tomorrow held. The money was tied up in legal battles, my home was a crime scene, and my family was in chains. But as I took a deep breath of the damp, fresh air, I realized for the first time in my life I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me the story. I was the one holding the pen. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of flashing lights and shouting voices, but I moved through it like a ghost in a dream. The federal agents had cordoned off the Grand Hyatt, and the once glitzy ballroom had been transformed into a sprawling crime scene. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face, watching as the black SUVs carried away the wreckage of my old life. Julian, Isabella, and Thorne, the unholy trinity of my betrayal, were gone, headed for cells that no amount of money could unlock. Marcus stood beside me, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the habitual alertness of a man who knew that even a fallen empire has its loyalists. "The feds want a statement, Elena," he said quietly. "But they're also worried." Julian's reach went deep. "They're moving you to a secure location tonight." "I don't want a safe house, Marcus," I said, looking at the USB drive I still gripped in my hand. "A safe house is just another cage. I spent 10 years in one of those. I'm done hiding." "This isn't just about Julian anymore," Marcus warned, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "The files you leaked from Project Lazarus, they didn't just implicate a tech mogul and a surgeon. Look at the names on the encrypted investor list we didn't broadcast yet. These are people who sit in the highest offices of the state. You didn't just break a window, you brought down the whole house. And the people still inside are going to be looking for someone to blame." I looked down at the drive. I had only broadcasted the hospital footage and the medical forgeries. The deep financial rot, the names of the politicians, the judges, and the city officials who had taken Julian's blood money was still hidden in the encryption. It was my insurance policy. It was the only thing keeping me alive. "Take me to Sarah," I said. "She's the only one who knows what really happened in that hospital before the fire. She's the only one I trust." We drove in silence through the pre-dawn streets of Seattle. The city was waking up to a world where its favorite golden couple had been exposed as monsters. Every newsstand, every digital screen was plastered with my face. "The woman who returned from the dead," the headlines screamed. We found Sarah at a small, private clinic on the outskirts of the city. She had escaped the fire with minor burns and smoke inhalation, but her spirit was unbroken. When she saw me, she burst into tears, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I thought they got you," she sobbed. "When the alarms went off and the smoke started filling the halls, I thought I'd sent you to your death. You gave me my life back, Sarah," I said, holding her hands. "But it's not over. Thorne's people are still out there. And the people who funded him are even more dangerous." Sarah wiped her eyes and looked at Marcus, then back at me. "There's something you didn't see in the basement, Alina." Before the fire, I saw Thorne moving a specific set of files to a private server, one that wasn't connected to the hospital network. He called it the ledger. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the end game. Julian wasn't just laundering money, he was building a biological database. He was looking for a way to make his power permanent. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, permanent?" "Genetic mapping," Sarah whispered. He was targeting high-profile individuals, people with power, and finding their medical vulnerabilities. He wasn't just bribing them, he was holding their lives in his hands. If a senator needed a transplant that didn't exist, Julian found one. If a governor had a terminal illness, Julian had the experimental cure. He didn't just own them, he kept them alive, and if they crossed him, the cure stopped. The magnitude of Julian's depravity finally hit me. He hadn't just been a criminal, he was a god complex personified. He had turned the very essence of life and death into a commodity. "We need that server," I said. "It's at the Summer Estate," Marcus realized. The Blackwood property in the San Juan Islands, that was always Julian's true fortress. He told everyone it was a vacation home, but the security I installed there, it was meant to withstand a siege. "Then that's where we're going," I said. As we left the clinic, the morning sun was finally breaking through the gray clouds. It felt like a sign, but I knew better. The brightest light often casts the darkest shadows. We headed for the docks where Marcus had a private boat waiting. As we sped across the cold blue waters toward the islands, I looked back at the Seattle skyline. I was no longer the girl who loved a billionaire. I was no longer the victim of a medical murder plot. I was a hunter. And as the Blackwood estate appeared on the horizon, a jagged monolith of stone and glass perched on a cliff, I knew that the final chapter of this story wouldn't be written in a courtroom. It would be written in the blood of the secrets Julian tried to bury. I checked the weight of the small pistol Marcus had given me. It felt heavy, cold, and necessary. "Alina," Marcus said as the boat slowed near the private pier, "once we go in there, there's no coming back. If we find what Sarah says is there, you'll be the most dangerous woman in the world. They will never stop hunting you." "Let them come," I said, stepping onto the dock. "I've already died once. The second time won't be nearly as easy for them." The Blackwood estate was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, a jagged fortress of obsidian glass and cold basalt that seemed to grow out of the very cliffs of the San Juan Islands. As we climbed the steep stone steps leading from the pier, the air was silent, save for the rhythmic crash of the Pacific against the rocks below. The house didn't look like a home, it looked like a tomb for secrets that the world was never meant to discover. Marcus led the way, his movements fluid and cautious. He bypassed the main biometric scanner with a device that mimicked Julian's own retinal map, a fail-safe Marcus had built into the system years ago without Julian's knowledge. The massive steel doors hissed open, revealing a foyer that was a cavern of shadows and expensive marble. "The server room is 3 levels down," Marcus whispered, his hand never leaving his sidearm. "Under the foundation. It has its own power grid and its own oxygen supply. If Julian triggered a lockdown from his cell, we have less than an hour before the system wipes everything." We moved through the house, past the silent witnesses of my former life, the paintings Julian bought to impress guests, the grand piano I never learned to play, the sprawling dining table where we shared meals that were nothing but hollow performances. It all felt like a museum of a dead woman. As we descended into the sublevels, the temperature dropped. The walls transitioned from polished stone to reinforced concrete. At the bottom of the spiral staircase, a single door of brushed titanium stood between us and the truth. Marcus swiped a black card and entered a long, complex sequence of numbers. With a heavy thud of shifting bolts, the vault opened. The server room hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. Blue lights pulsed along the walls like the heartbeat of a digital beast. In the center of the room sat a single glass terminal. "This is it," I said, my voice echoing in the cold air. I sat at the terminal and began the decryption process. Using the master key Sarah had given me, I pierced through the final layers of Julian's firewalls. The screen flickered and then a file titled "The Ledger" appeared. I opened it, and the sheer scale of the horror took my breath away. It wasn't just a list of names, it was a map of human suffering. Julian hadn't just been tracking medical vulnerabilities, he had been creating them. He had used his pharmaceutical connections to introduce subtle, long-term toxins into the private water supplies of political rivals. Then, Dr. Thorne would appear as the miracle worker with the cure, binding these powerful people to Julian's will forever. He wasn't just a businessman, Marcus said, staring at the screen. He was a parasite. I scrolled further down, looking for the end game Sarah had mentioned. I found a subfolder labeled Vance, Alina. My hands began to shake. I clicked it open. Inside were my own medical records, but they weren't from St. Jude S. They were from a private clinic I had visited years ago for a routine checkup. There was a handwritten note from Dr. Thorne. The subject's genetic markers for the Vance Estate Trust are perfect. However, her moral compass is a liability. Termination is the only path to total asset consolidation. Project Lazarus requires her clearance. I realized then that my marriage hadn't been an accident of love. It had been a long-term acquisition. Julian didn't marry me for who I was. He married me for a specific genetic signature that was required to unlock a multi-billion-dollar heritage trust left by his own grandfather, a trust that could only be accessed by a stable, married heir with a specific lineage. He had been planning my death since the day he proposed. Alina, Marcus said sharply, pointing to a secondary monitor, we have a problem. On the security feed, 3 high-speed boats were approaching the island. They weren't marked with police or federal logos. They were sleek, black, and carried men armed with assault rifles. Julian's partners, I whispered. The ones who are still free, they're coming to burn the ledger. We can't finish the download in time, Marcus said, checking his watch. It's too much data. If we stay, we're pinned in a tomb. If we leave, the truth dies with this room. I'm not leaving, I said, my voice turning to iron. Marcus, I need you to go to the roof. The satellite uplink, if you can manually realign the dish to the public cloud, I can broadcast the ledger live, not to the police but to every news server in the world at once. That'll take 10 minutes of manual adjustment, Alina. I'll be a sitting duck up there once they land. It's the only way, I said, looking him in the eyes. Julian took everything from me, my trust, my family, my safety. I won't let him take the truth. Go, I'll hold the door from here. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. He handed me his spare magazine and vanished up the stairs. I turned back to the terminal. I started the broadcast sequence. The screen showed a progress bar initializing global uplink, 2%. From above, I heard the first muffled cracks of gunfire. The siege of Blackwood had begun. I sat in the blue light of the servers, my finger on the send key, watching the clock. Julian wanted to be a god who controlled life and death. I was about to show him that even gods can be torn down by a woman with nothing left to lose. The elevator at the end of the hall dinged. The heavy vault door hadn't been fully closed. A man stepped out dressed in a tactical suit, his face obscured by a mask. He leveled his weapon at me. Step away from the console, Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice cold. The ledger belongs to the firm. The ledger belongs to the ghosts, I replied, my hand hovering over the override. And I'm the one who's going to let them speak. The man in the tactical suit took a slow, measured step forward, the muzzle of his rifle never wavering from my forehead. The hum of the servers seemed to grow louder, a digital roar that filled the silence between us. I could hear the distant, rhythmic thud of Marcus's rifle from the roof. He was holding the line, but he was one man against a small army. You're a long way from the penthouse, Alina, the man said, his voice distorted by the comms unit in his mask. You were supposed to be a tragic headline in the morning paper. Instead, you've become an expensive nuisance. Give me the drive and I'll make sure your death is quicker than what Thorne had planned. I looked at the monitor. Global uplink, 45%. It was too slow. My heart was a drum in my chest, but my hands remained steady on the console. The firm isn't real, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. It's just a collection of frightened men hiding behind an offshore bank account. Julian was your front man, and now that he's broken, you're scrambling to bury the bodies. But you're too late. The world is already waking up. The world only knows what we tell them, he countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Information is a commodity we own. Now move. I didn't move. Instead, I tapped a command on the side panel, a secondary security protocol Marcus had shown me. Do you know what a halon dump is? I asked. The man froze. He knew. Halon gas was used in high-end server rooms to extinguish fires by displacing oxygen. It was lethal to anyone inside without a breathing apparatus. If you fire that weapon, the spark will trigger the emergency sensors, I lied, my gaze holding his. The room will seal, the gas will drop, and we both die in the dark. Is the ledger worth your life? Because it's certainly worth mine. It was a bluff. The sensors were currently bypassed for the uplink, but the hesitation in his eyes was all I needed. I slammed my hand onto the execute key for the secondary encryption burst. You're bluffing, he hissed, but he didn't fire. He lunged at me instead, swinging the butt of his rifle. I dove to the floor, the heavy weapon smashing into the glass terminal where my head had been a second ago. Shattered glass rained down like jagged diamonds. I scrambled under the main desk, my hand closing around the heavy metal fire extinguisher I had kept near me. He roared in frustration, kicking over a chair to reach me. I didn't wait. I sprayed the chemical foam directly into his face mask. He stumbled back, blinded and coughing. I surged up, swinging the heavy canister with every ounce of rage I had suppressed for 10 years. It connected with the side of his helmet with a bone-jarring crack. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. I scrambled back to the terminal. The screen was cracked, but the progress bar was still moving. 78%. Suddenly, the intercom system crackled to life. It wasn't Marcus. It was a voice I recognized instantly, a voice that had whispered sweet lies into my ear for a decade. Julian, Elena, can you hear me, darling? The sound of his voice in this cold, subterranean vault felt like a violation. Julian, how? You're in a federal cell. Money has a way of opening doors, even the heavy ones, Julian's voice echoed, smooth and chilling. I'm on the boat, Elena, I'm coming home. I saw the uplink. I saw what you're trying to do. It's a brave effort, really, but you don't understand the scale of what you're touching. If that data goes live, the global markets will collapse. Governments will fall. You'll be responsible for the deaths of millions, not just the unclaimed few at St. Jude S. I'm responsible for the truth, Julian, I spat, my fingers flying over the damaged keyboard to bypass the corrupted sectors. You're the one who built a throne out of corpses. I'm just the one pulling the rug. Think about Isabella, he continued, his tone shifting to that manipulative, soft cadence. She's fragile, she's already broken. If you release the ledger, she'll spend the rest of her life in a federal penitentiary. Is your revenge worth your own sister's soul? Isabella made her choice the moment she kissed you over my planned grave, I said. She's not my sister anymore, she's just another one of your assets, and assets get liquidated. The progress bar hit 92%. I'm at the door, Elena, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The mercenaries are with me. Marcus is gone. My men took the roof 5 minutes ago. You're alone. Just stop the upload and we can go back to the way things were. We can fix this. I still love you in my own way. My heart shattered at the mention of Marcus. If he was gone, I truly was the last line of defense. But I didn't believe Julian. He was a predator and this was his final hunt. You never loved me, Julian, I said, tears finally stinging my eyes. You loved the genetics, you loved the trust fund, you loved the reflection of your own power in my eyes, but that girl is dead. You killed her at St. Jude S. The vault door began to groan, the heavy bolts screeching as a thermal torch began to cut through the titanium. Sparks showered into the room like hellish fireworks. 98%, 99%. The screen flickered one last time, uplink complete, global broadcast initialized. The world was about to see it all. The toxins, the bribes, the Project Lazarus files, and the secret bank accounts of the world's most powerful men. The vault door blew inward with a deafening explosion of pressure and smoke. I stood up, my silhouette framed by the glowing blue servers, holding the digital recorder Sarah had given me, the one that had captured the last 3 minutes of Julian's confession over the intercom. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. Julian, he wasn't in scrubs or a jumpsuit now. He was in a bespoke charcoal suit looking every bit the titan of industry. But his eyes were hollow, the eyes of a man who realized his empire was now a pile of ash. "You did it," he whispered, looking at the screens. "You actually did it." "I didn't do it for revenge, Julian," I said, stepping over the unconscious mercenary. "I did it for the ghosts, and they're coming for you." Julian pulled a small silver pistol from his breast pocket. He didn't look angry, he looked tired. "Then we'll go together, Alina. Just like our vows, till death do us part." He leveled the gun at my heart, but before he could pull the trigger, a red dot appeared on his chest. The metallic glint of the pistol in Julian's hand seemed to slow down time itself. The roar of his voice echoed off the concrete walls, a final, desperate act of a man whose ego had been his ultimate undoing. He leveled the barrel directly at my chest, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, I didn't see the man I had shared a bed with for a decade. I saw a rabid animal backed into a corner. "Julian, no," Isabella screamed from the doorway, but it wasn't out of love for me. She knew that if he fired that gun on a live stream, there would be no lawyers in the world expensive enough to save her from an accessory to murder charge. A deafening crack shattered the air. I braced for the impact, for the coldness of lead, but it never came. Instead, Julian let out a guttural howl and stumbled back, the silver pistol clattering to the floor. The red dot on his chest hadn't been a laser sight from a mercenary, it was the infrared beam of a tactical team. Marcus stepped through the shattered vault door, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes burning with a grim satisfaction. He wasn't dead. He had been the one to lead the federal tactical unit through the back tunnels of the estate. "Drop to your knees now," Marcus roared, his rifle trained on Julian. The firm's mercenaries, seeing the tide had turned, dropped their weapons. They were professionals, they knew when a contract was dead. Julian sat on the floor, clutching his shoulder where a non-lethal round had struck him, his bespoke suit ruined by soot and blood. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 10 years I saw him clearly, a small, terrified man who had built a mountain of lies just to feel tall. "You'll have nothing without me, Alina," he hissed, the poison still dripping from his tongue. "You're just a shadow I created." "I was a shadow," I said, my voice finally finding its strength, ringing out over the hum of the servers that were still broadcasting his crimes to the world. "But the thing about shadows, Julian, is that they only exist when there's a light. Tonight, I found my own." The federal agents swarmed the room, zip-tying Julian and Isabella. As they led them away, I turned back to the terminal. The ledger was fully uploaded. The Vance Empire wasn't just crumbling, it was being leveled to the ground in real time. An agent approached me, wrapping a shock blanket around my shoulders. It was Henderson, the lead investigator who had been trying to crack Thorne's network for years. "Mrs. Vance, what you just did. It's going to change everything, but we need to move. This island isn't safe yet." "Wait," I said, pulling the digital recorder from my pocket. "There's more. On the server under folder 7, the second patient. Julian wasn't just targeting me today." We rushed back to the main monitors. I opened the file and my heart nearly stopped. It was a surgical schedule for a secret clinic in the city, timed for exactly 2 hours from now. "The patient, Silas Thorne." "Thorne?" Marcus asked, leaning over my shoulder. "Why would Julian target his own doctor?" "Because Thorne knew too much," I whispered, reading the notes. Julian had arranged for a routine procedure to be performed by a junior resident who owed Julian a gambling debt. Thorne was going to be silenced the same way he silenced everyone else, an unfortunate complication on the operating table. "He was cleaning house," Henderson said, already barking orders into his radio. "He was going to kill the only witness who could link him to the medical murders." We didn't wait. We took the helicopter from the estate's helipad, the blades cutting through the morning mist as we raced toward the city. The sun was beginning to peek through the Seattle clouds, the light reflecting off the glass towers like a promise. We burst into the private clinic just as the junior resident was raising a syringe of potassium chloride. "FBI, drop it!" Henderson yelled. The resident froze, his face turning as white as his lab coat. "Doctor." Thorne, already sedated on the table, lay oblivious to how close he had come to the accident he had perfected for others. I stood in the doorway of the operating room, watching as they handcuffed the resident. I looked at Thorn, the man who had held my life in his hands just days ago. He was a monster, but today he was also a victim of the very system he helped create. I walked out of the clinic and into the crisp morning air. The news vans were everywhere, reporters screaming my name, cameras flashing like lightning. I didn't stop for any of them. I walked to the edge of the plaza and looked up at the sky. The battle for my life was over. The war for the truth had been won. Marcus walked up to me, handing me a coffee. "What's next, Alina? You have the evidence. The money from the trust is being frozen for the victims, and Julian is never seeing the sun again." I looked at the city, no longer feeling like a stranger in my own life. Next, I think I'd like to find out who Alina really is without a billionaire's name attached to her. I pulled the wedding ring from my finger, the diamond that had once felt like a symbol of love, then a shackle. I didn't throw it away. I handed it to Marcus. "Sell this. Give the money to Sarah's brother's family. It's time this stone did something good." I walked toward the horizon, the weight of the past 10 years falling away with every step. I was Alina. I was a survivor. And for the first time in my life, the story was mine to write. The ending I provided in Part 10 was the definitive conclusion to Alina's journey, the fall of the Vance Empire and her finally reclaiming her identity. However, for a high-stakes YouTube thriller, a hidden epilogue or a final twist can act as the perfect post-credits hook to keep your audience talking. Here is the final bonus chapter, the epilogue, to bring your total word count over the 11,000 mark and provide a chilling final note. Part 11. The Phantom Legacy Epilogue. 6 months had passed since the morning I walked out of that private clinic and into the light. The Vance trial of the century had dominated every headline from New York to Tokyo. Julian was currently serving 2 life sentences in a maximum security federal facility in Colorado. Dr. Thorn had struck a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, trading his testimony against the firm for a permanent stay in a psychiatric prison. Isabella had vanished into the state system, a shadow of the woman who had once tried to steal my life. I was living in a small coastal town in Maine now, under a name that didn't carry the weight of billions. The house was modest, shingle-sided with a porch that looked out over the Atlantic. No marble, no obsidian glass, no cameras. Just the sound of the waves and the salt in the air. Marcus had stayed on for a while, acting as a consultant for the federal task force dismantling the remnants of the Lazarus Project, but he had eventually moved on to start his own security firm. We talked once a week. He was the only link to a past I was determined to outrun. I sat on my porch, a cup of tea in my hands, watching the sunset bleed crimson over the water. My laptop was open on my lap, but I wasn't looking at the news. I was looking at a blank document, the first chapter of the book I was finally ready to write. The silence was broken by the crunch of gravel. A mail truck pulled away from the end of my long driveway. I walked down to the box, the evening air cool against my skin. Inside was a single heavy cream envelope. There was no return address, no stamp. Just my new name written in a precise, elegant calligraphy that made my heart skip a beat. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph and a handwritten note. The photograph was of me, taken just moments ago, sitting on my porch from the vantage point of the tree line. My breath hitched. I looked toward the woods, but the shadows were already too deep. I turned the note over. The handwriting was unmistakable. It wasn't Julian S. and it wasn't Thorn's. It belonged to Claire Sterling, the governor's chief of staff, the woman who had disappeared the night of the pier. The ledger was a masterpiece, Alina, the note read. But you forgot one thing about a global broadcast. You didn't just expose the villains. You exposed the vacancies. Power doesn't vanish, it just changes hands. The firm is gone, but the board is now hiring. We'll be in touch soon. Enjoy the view while it lasts. I felt the old familiar chill crawl down my spine, but this time it didn't paralyze me. I didn't run back into the house to hide. I didn't call the police. I walked to the edge of the woods, the Polaroid in my hand. I looked into the darkness, my eyes steady. I knew they were watching. I knew the war hadn't ended, it had just moved to a different theater. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I had memorized but never hoped to use. "Marcus," I said, my voice as sharp as a scalpel, "get your gear. They found me, and tell Henderson to get the task force ready. It's time to go after the board." I looked at the photograph one last time before tearing it into pieces and letting the wind carry it out toward the sea. Julian had tried to kill me because I was a liability. Claire wanted me because I was an asset. They were both wrong. I was the storm they hadn't planned for, and this time I wasn't just surviving, I was hunting. I walked back to my house, the lights glowing warmly against the encroaching night. As I closed the door, I didn't look back. I had spent years being the surgeon's shadow. Now it was time for the world to see what happens when the shadow finally steps into the light.